Sumerian mythology. The oldest recorded mythology on Earth didn't begin with a bang. It began with a decision. The Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia, writing in cuneiform on clay tablets as early as 3500 BCE, believed that humans were created from clay and divine blood for one explicit purpose: to serve the gods and relieve them of labor. The sky god An, the wind god Enlil, and the water god Enki formed the core of a pantheon that ran the universe like an administration, with specific duties, territories, and politics. Their great hero Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, is the subject of one of history's oldest written epics, composed around 2100 BCE, and his story contains a flood myth that predates the biblical account of Noah by over 1,000 years. Death in Sumerian belief led to Kur, a dark, dusty underworld of silence and misery, where souls wandered regardless of how well they had lived. No paradise awaited, no reward, just eternal gray. The sheer age of this mythology makes everything else feel downstream from it, because in many ways, it is. Egyptian mythology. Ancient Egypt ran its mythology for over 3,000 years, from around 3100 BCE to roughly 400 CE, making it one of the longest-lived religious traditions in human history. The universe began as a dark, primordial ocean called Nun, from which the first god rose on a mound of earth and began creating everything else. Gods were depicted as human-animal hybrids: Ra with a falcon head, Anubis with a jackal head, Thoth with an ibis head, each form carrying specific symbolic weight that Egyptians read as naturally as a language. The dead faced the most consequential moment of their existence in the Hall of Two Truths, where their heart was weighed against the feather of Maat, goddess of truth and order. Too heavy with sin, and a crocodile-headed creature devoured it. The story of Osiris, murdered by his brother Set, resurrected by his wife Isis, and reborn as the god of the afterlife, gave ordinary Egyptians a template for death and renewal they could actually believe in. Every morning when the sun rose, it meant Ra had survived another night battling the serpent Apophis in the underworld. Every single day was a victory. Babylonian mythology. The Babylonians inherited the Sumerian tradition and made it grander, darker, and more structurally epic. Their creation myth, the Enuma Elish, describes the god Marduk slaying the primordial chaos dragon Tiamat in a cosmic battle, then splitting her body in half, one half becoming the sky, the other the earth. The world is literally built from a corpse. Marduk became the patron god of Babylon and the king of the pantheon through this act of violence, establishing a template where power is earned by conquest rather than birthright. Their flood myth features a character named Utnapishtim, the clearest direct ancestor of Noah, who received divine warning, built a boat, and survived the deluge while humanity drowned. The Tablet of Destinies, a physical object that encoded the fate of everything in existence, could be stolen, and in some myths it was, meaning reality itself was vulnerable to theft. Babylonian mythology understood that the universe was not inherently safe, and it built that anxiety directly into its cosmology. Hindu mythology. No mythology on this list is still as actively lived as Hindu mythology, which traces its literary origins to the Rig Veda around 1500 BCE, and continues to shape the daily lives of over 1 billion people today. Its scale is almost incomprehensible. The Mahabharata alone is roughly 10 times the length of the Iliad and Odyssey combined. The Trimurti, Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, and Shiva the destroyer, represent not gods competing for power, but a single cosmic cycle of creation, maintenance, and dissolution that repeats endlessly. Time itself is structured into vast cycles called yugas. According to tradition, we currently live in the Kali Yuga, the darkest and most degraded age, which still has hundreds of thousands of years left to run. Vishnu has descended to Earth in 10 primary avatars. The Dashavatara, whenever existence was at a crisis point, taking forms ranging from a fish to a dwarf to a warrior prince. The gods here are not remote. They intervene. They argue. They fall in love. They make catastrophic mistakes, and the universe keeps spinning regardless. Greek mythology. The most influential mythology in Western culture began with a war between generations. The Titans ruled the cosmos until Zeus led a 10-year conflict called the Titanomachy, defeating them and sealing them in Tartarus, a pit so deep that, according to Hesiod writing around 700 BCE, an anvil dropped from the Earth's surface would fall for 9 days before hitting bottom. The 12 Olympians divided dominion over the world: sea, sky, war, wisdom, harvest, death, and then spent most of their time interfering in human affairs with catastrophic results. Heroes like Hercules, Perseus, and Achilles were demigods, half-human hybrids who inherited godlike power, but fully human suffering, and their stories almost always end badly in ways that feel deliberate. The underworld had geography: Elysium for heroes, the gray asphodel meadows for ordinary souls, and Tartarus for those who specifically offended the gods. Prometheus stole fire from Olympus to give to humanity and was chained to a mountain where an eagle ate his regenerating liver every single day for eternity. The punishment for helping humans was eternal, daily agony. Greek mythology never lets you forget what the gods actually think of us. Norse mythology. What separates Norse mythology from almost every other tradition is that it knows exactly how it ends and tells you up front. 9 worlds hang from the branches and roots of Yggdrasil, a world tree of incomprehensible size, housing gods, humans, giants, dwarves, and the dead across its different realms. Odin, the chief god, sacrificed one eye for a single drink from the well of wisdom, then hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days, stabbed with his own spear, to receive the knowledge of the runes. The trickster Loki shifts from useful ally to architect of catastrophe, eventually engineering the death of Baldur, the most beloved god, and sealing the fate of everything. Ragnarok, the prophesied end, kills most of the major gods in specific, named ways. Thor kills the Midgard serpent and dies from its venom 9 steps later. Odin is swallowed whole by the wolf Fenrir. The sun goes dark. The sea rises. And then, according to the prose Edda recorded by Snorri Sturluson around 1220 CE, a new world rises from the ocean. The end is not the end, but the gods who fought and died for it never get to see it. Chinese mythology. Chinese mythology begins with a giant who slept inside a cosmic egg for 18,000 years. When Pangu finally woke and broke free, the light elements rose to form the sky, and the heavy elements sank to form the earth. And Pangu spent the next 18,000 years holding them apart with his body so they wouldn't collapse back together. When he finally died, his breath became the wind, his voice became thunder, his eyes became the sun and moon, and his flesh became the soil of the earth. The goddess Nuwa, depicted with a serpent's body, created humans from yellow clay, then repaired the sky when a cosmic pillar broke, and floods threatened to destroy everything, using stones of 5 colors to patch the damage. Above it all, the Jade Emperor rules a heavenly bureaucracy that mirrors imperial Chinese government in extraordinary detail, complete with ministries, officials, audits, and promotions. A divine administration running the cosmos with the same structures as the empire below. The mythology is inseparable from history. Many mythological figures are simultaneously treated as historical emperors, making the boundary between legend and record deliberately and permanently blurred. Roman mythology. Rome didn't invent its mythology so much as inherit and reframe it. The Greek pantheon was adopted wholesale. Zeus became Jupiter, Ares became Mars, Aphrodite became Venus. But the reframing mattered enormously because Roman mythology served a political function that Greek mythology never quite did. The founding story involves twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, nursed by a wolf after being abandoned on the Tiber River, who grew up to found a city, and then Romulus killed Remus over a boundary dispute, making fratricide the founding act of Western civilization's defining empire. The hero Aeneas, a Trojan survivor, traveled to Italy after the fall of Troy in a journey Virgil immortalized in the Aeneid around 19 BCE, making Romans the heirs of a great and ancient civilization rather than upstarts. Roman emperors were deified after death, and sometimes during their own lifetimes. Julius Caesar was declared a god in 42 BCE, meaning Roman mythology and Roman politics were not adjacent to each other, but the same thing written in different registers. Zoroastrian mythology. Zoroastrianism, originating in the Iranian plateau and dating back conservatively to around 1500 BCE, though the exact date of its founder Zarathustra remains one of history's most disputed scholarly questions, produced something no prior mythology had clearly articulated. A perfectly dualistic universe. Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of light, truth, and creation, stands in absolute opposition to Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit of darkness and lies, and the entire cosmos is their battlefield. Unlike mythologies, where good gods are simply stronger than evil ones, here the conflict is genuine. The outcome is not predetermined by divine power, but by the cumulative choices of every human being, since every thought, word, and deed tips the cosmic scales in one direction or the other. At the end of time, an apocalyptic event called Frashokareti will purify the world through a river of molten metal that flows across all of creation. The wicked burn in agony. The righteous feel it as warm milk. Zoroastrianism's influence on every Abrahamic religion that followed. The concept of Satan, of heaven and hell as moral destinations, of an apocalypse and a final judgment, is documented and direct. Almost every theological architecture the modern world takes for granted was built on this foundation first. Canaanite mythology. Canaanite mythology is the tradition the Bible was written in direct conversation with, which makes it one of the most consequential and least discussed mythologies in the Western world. El, the fatherly chief god, whose name literally became one of the primary words for God in Hebrew, presided over a divine council, while Baal, the storm god, did the active work of fighting for the living world. Baal's great enemy was Mot, the god of death, and their conflict was seasonal and literal. When Mot defeated Baal and dragged him to the underworld, crops failed, rain stopped, and the earth went gray. When Baal returned, the rains came back. The texts that record all of this were discovered only in 1929, at a site called Ras Shamra in modern Syria, written on tablets in a language called Ugaritic, meaning this entire tradition was essentially unknown to modern scholarship until less than a century ago. The parallels to Genesis, to the Psalms, to the structure of early Israelite worship are extensive and documented, and historians continue to work through what they mean about the origins of monotheism. Aztec mythology. The Aztecs believed the world had already been created and destroyed 4 times before humans arrived in it. We live in the 5th sun, and according to the tradition, it will end in catastrophic earthquakes when its energy is finally exhausted. The current sun and moon only exist because the gods gathered at a sacred fire and sacrificed themselves to set them in motion, and without ongoing human sacrifice to feed the sun's energy, it stops moving. Darkness covers the earth, and everything dies. This was not metaphor. This was engineering. Huitzilopochtli, the sun god and god of war, was born fully armed from his mother's womb and immediately fought off 400 siblings who were trying to kill him before he could exist, establishing the tone of the entire mythology. The dead traveled through 9 levels of the underworld Mictlan over 4 years, facing specific trials at each level, guided only by items buried with them. The 260-day ritual calendar and the 365-day solar calendar meshed in a 52-year cycle that, when it completed, required a new fire ceremony to ensure the world continued. The Aztecs did not take continuation for granted. Mayan mythology, the Popol Vuh. The Quiche Maya creation epic, recorded around 1550 CE, but encoding far older oral traditions, describes 3 separate attempts by the gods to create humans. The first were made from mud. They dissolved in rain and couldn't hold their shape. The second were made from wood. They walked and talked, but had no souls, no memory, and no gratitude toward their creators. So they were destroyed by a flood, and according to the text, their descendants became monkeys. The third attempt used maize, and those people worked. The hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, are the mythology's great protagonists, descending into Xibalba, the underworld ruled by 12 lords of death, and defeating them through a series of ball games, tricks, and trials in a narrative that reads as genuinely suspenseful even now. Time was the Mayans' sacred obsession. Their calendrical mythology calculated cycles stretching millions of years into the past with a mathematical precision that still impresses modern astronomers. The famous 2012 end of the world prediction was a modern misreading of a calendar cycle. The Maya never predicted an ending. They predicted a transition. Japanese mythology. Japanese mythology begins with creation itself emerging from an act of stirring. The divine couple Izanagi and Izanami stood on the bridge of heaven, pushed a jeweled spear into the primordial ocean below, and when they lifted it, the drops that fell from its tip hardened into the Japanese islands. The 2 gods descended, built a home, and began producing the world, until Izanami died, giving birth to the fire god, a death so consequential it fractured the entire cosmos. Izanagi descended to Yomi, the underworld, to retrieve her, was told not to look at her, and of course looked, seeing her body already rotting and swarming with the dead. He fled. She sent demons after him, and at the border he sealed the entrance to Yomi with a boulder, the 2 former spouses screaming threats at each other through the rock. The sun goddess Amaterasu eventually locked herself in a cave after her brother Susanu's violent rampages, and the world went dark until the other gods staged a raucous, bawdy party outside the cave, making her curious enough to open the door. The Kajiki, recording all of this in 712 CE, also established that the emperor was a direct descendant of Amaterasu, a claim that remained official Japanese state doctrine until January 1946. Celtic mythology. Almost nothing of Celtic mythology was written down during the period it was actually alive. The Druids preserved it entirely through oral tradition by design, considering writing it down a form of desecration, which means that nearly everything we know arrived through the filter of Christian monks in medieval Ireland who were simultaneously trying to record and contain it. The Tuatha De Danann, a race of luminous godlike beings, arrived in Ireland in a blaze of fire and defeated the existing inhabitants in 2 great battles before being driven underground themselves into the fairy mounds, the Sidhe, where they became the fairy folk of later folklore. Cuchulainn, the great hero of the Ulster cycle, entered a battle frenzy called the Rheastrad, so violent that his body physically distorted. One eye sank into his skull, while the other bulged outward. His muscles rotated inside his skin, and he became unrecognizable and indiscriminate in his killing. The other world, called Tir na Nog, existed beyond the Western Sea, where time moved at a different rate. A year there was a day in the mortal world, and heroes who visited it often returned to find everyone they had known already dead and gone. Hittite mythology. The Hittites built one of the ancient world's great empires in what is now Turkey, and their mythology is the earliest known example of Indo-European religious ideas colliding with Near Eastern traditions and producing something entirely new from the collision. Their storm god Tarhunt battled a stone giant called Ulukumi who grew from the seafloor upward at a terrifying rate, eventually reaching a size large enough to block the sun and threaten to tear heaven itself apart. The Kumarbi cycle, their primary mythological text, describes cosmic succession myths, gods overthrowing parent gods through violence or deception, that show direct parallels to both Greek and Mesopotamian traditions and suggest a shared cultural current running underneath all of them. One of the Hittites' most distinctive myths involves Telepanu, the god of agriculture who vanished in a fury and caused universal blight. Crops failed, animals stopped reproducing, and the gods themselves began to starve. According to the tradition, a bee was sent to find him, discovered him sleeping in a meadow, and stung him awake. What's remarkable is not the story, but how it was used. Hittite priests recited these myths as part of ritual ceremonies designed to literally summon the missing god back into the world. Phoenician mythology. The Phoenicians were the great maritime traders of the ancient world, and their mythology spread across the Mediterranean as cargo, influencing Greek, Roman, and Carthaginian religious traditions in ways that are still being fully mapped. They shared the core Canaanite figures, El, Baal, Mot, but added a distinctly seafaring dimension that reflected who they were. Melkart, the god of the city of Tyre, was a Herculean wandering figure who traveled to the edges of the known world and was worshipped as far away as the coast of Spain, with temples at the very limits of Phoenician navigation. The story of Europa, a Phoenician princess abducted by Zeus and carried to Crete, setting off events that would shape Greek mythology, represents how thoroughly Phoenician stories penetrated into the Greek tradition that would eventually overshadow them. When Carthage was founded, according to tradition, its queen Dido asked only for as much land as an ox hide could cover, then cut the hide into strips thin enough to encircle an entire hilltop. The Phoenicians, even in their foundation myths, were people who found clever solutions to impossible constraints, because that is what traders and sailors have to do to survive. Inca mythology. The Inca mythological tradition centered on a supreme creator god named Viracocha, who rose from Lake Titicaca, the world's highest navigable lake, sitting at over 3,800 meters above sea level, and began creating the world. His first attempt produced stone people who failed to satisfy him, so he sent a flood to start over, then populated the earth with the ancestors of the people who would build one of history's most extraordinary empires. The sun god Inti was the direct divine ancestor of the Sapa Inca emperor, meaning the living ruler was considered a literal child of the sun, governing on his behalf and accountable to him directly. Dead emperors were not removed from political life. Their mummies were kept seated on thrones, fed meals, consulted on major decisions, and carried through the streets in processions. The dead held property, maintained households, and retained political influence. Cuzco, the sacred capital, was organized around a system of 41 radiating sacred lines called the Sequay system, each tied to specific mythological narratives and ritual obligations, turning the entire city into a living map of the cosmos. Almost every source we have was recorded after the Spanish conquest of 1533 CE, meaning an entire civilization's worth of oral tradition passed through a colonial filter before it reached us. Yoruba mythology. Yoruba mythology, originating in what is now Nigeria and Benin, and dating its literary traces to around 800 CE, is one of the few traditions on this list that didn't stay in one place. The transatlantic slave trade forcibly carried Yoruba religious knowledge across the ocean, where it transformed under pressure into candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, and related traditions across the Americas, meaning Yoruba mythology is simultaneously ancient West African cosmology and living religion practiced by millions of people in the Western Hemisphere today. The supreme being, Olodumare, is distant and unknowable, working through 401 orishas. Divine intermediaries, the 401st being deliberately uncountable, representing everything beyond human comprehension, each controlling specific domains of life, from thunder to the ocean to iron to disease. Shango, the god of thunder and lightning, was according to tradition a historical king of the Oyo Empire who became deified after death, and is now one of the most widely worshipped figures in the entire Yoruba diaspora. The divination system of Ifa encodes the entire mythology across 256 sacred texts called Odus, and it is consulted as a living oracle to this day. UNESCO recognized Ifa as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2005. Slavic mythology. Slavic mythology is one of the most fascinating and most damaged traditions in this entire video. When Christianity swept through Eastern Europe between roughly 900 and 1200 CE, it systematically destroyed the written and material records of the existing religion. And since the Slavic peoples had already been preserving their mythology primarily through oral tradition, the loss was catastrophic. What survives comes from folk tales, place names, brief hostile mentions in Christian chronicles, and the painstaking work of modern scholars trying to reconstruct a system from fragments. The two great cosmic powers were Perun, the storm god who controlled lightning and ruled the sky, and Veles, the serpentine underworld god who controlled cattle, wealth, and the dead, and they were locked in an internal conflict where Veles stole something precious from Perun. Perun hunted him across the earth in a storm of lightning strikes, destroyed him, and then Veles regenerated and stole something again. The cycle never ended. Baba Yaga, the witch whose hut stands on chicken legs and who flies through the air in a mortar and pestle, is the mythology's most recognizable surviving figure. Neither purely evil nor purely helpful. She tests heroes, and the nature of the test determines everything. She is chaos with manners. She is the forest deciding whether you deserve to leave it. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.